Story 1. I used to believe that if you swallowed a watermelon seed, an entire watermelon would grow inside your stomach. I was terrified of eating fruit for a long time because of that. Kids' logic is undefeated, honestly. Story 2. Another child told me this, and it disturbed me for years until I realized it was insane. Dragonflies have an extremely painful sting, and it can only be treated by transferring it to another person. Doctors decided to use infants for this since they won't remember it, and this was why my sister cried constantly as a baby. I thought my parents were monsters. Story 3. That a large bearded man could slide down my chimney and deliver gifts. All this after he landed 20,000 pounds of reindeer and other presents on my roof. Story 4. Watching old black and white TV shows, I believed that life was like that back then. They had not invented color yet. Story 5. I wished my stuffed animals would come to life while I slept. So at bedtime, I would tell them to have fun and wake me up so I could play with the real-life versions of them. Story 6. I used to believe that if I swallowed gum, it would stay in my stomach for 7 years. I avoided it completely, thinking I would have a large, stuck ball of gum in there forever. Story 7. I thought actors replayed the movie each time we watched it. It struck me one day as I was rewinding that they were all moving backward very quickly, and I had to stop and reevaluate what I thought I knew. Story 8. I used to think the moon followed our car whenever we drove at night, as if it was personally stalking us. I was completely serious about it. Story 9. For some reason, I believed that to adopt a child, parents would go into a factory and a lineup of adoptable children would be shown to them on a conveyor belt. I remember wondering if the children lived on the conveyor belt and how that worked with food and other necessities. I probably realized it made no sense when I saw Annie for the first time. Story 10. Samantha and Endora from Bewitched were real witches who could see me, and they would curse me if I didn't show appreciation after the show. But I loved Bewitched, so I kept watching it and worrying. I would clap after every episode and tell them they did a great job. My parents were concerned about me. Story 11. I didn't realize this until John Mulaney pointed it out, but I thought quicksand was going to be a much bigger problem than it turned out to be. Story 12. Everyone was born white, and when they reached a certain age, they could choose. Some just chose earlier than others. I lived in a very small town in Kansas that had no people of color. The same was true for the few surrounding towns we visited. I was a broken 5-year-old when I discovered I would never be a beautiful Latina girl. I was sheltered. Story 13. The light inside the refrigerator stayed on when you closed the door, and tiny refrigerator inhabitants lived there. Story 14. That math was different when my dad was young. If I asked a math problem, he would give me the right answer but would always add, when I was in school. I would think to myself that I needed the answer for now, not long ago. Story 15. That women were physically incapable of getting pregnant after the age of 35. Later, I was told that if they had a baby past that age, it was considered a miracle if the baby survived. I realize now that my mother was a deeply misinformed woman who repeated whatever she heard and taught it to her children as facts. Story 16. All the vitamins and nutrition were in the crust of my bread. My husband had to gently explain to me that the good stuff doesn't just float to the top. My grandmother just didn't want to waste anything because we were very poor. Story 17. I used to believe that headstones in graveyards would grow over time. I thought this because the older ones were always the biggest and most elaborate, while my sisters, who were twins, had flat stones when they died in childbirth. I remember thinking, I can't wait to see what their stones look like as they age. Story 18. My dad had a classic car that he worked on and drove around. He enjoyed listening to the oldies radio station. I was convinced that the car could only play old music. It didn't occur to me that he enjoyed that music in other places. The music was an essential part of riding in that car. Story 19. I remember my dad's response when I said that if you love someone, they love you back. He quietly laughed, gently explaining that it doesn't quite work like that. I was extremely puzzled and surprised. Story 20. The idea that your blood is blue inside your body and turns red outside is a common misconception. Once exposed to oxygen, it turns red. In retrospect, this concept makes little sense. However, everything from cartoons to books seem to illustrate a cycle of blue to red and back again. Story 21. When I was a child, I believed that there was a God and that he loved me. Life experiences and a broader knowledge of the world have shown that to be a rather laughable notion. Story 22. Politicians are intelligent and rational individuals. However, I was a child during the last decade of the Cold War, so I suppose that could be somewhat excused at the time. Story 23. The spouse's cousin lived in Florida as a young child and moved north during elementary school. The other cousins convinced him that there were such things as snow sharks, and he refused to play in the snow. Story 24. My older brother told me that boogers were dead brain cells. When my nose was running, he said my brain was dying. To this day, my mother still thinks I cried just because I didn't feel well. Story 25. Watching football on TV, I noticed that the referees spoke very loudly, even though they weren't yelling. I never considered the microphones. Story 26. When I die, if I am not cremated, I will become a skeleton, and I am terrified of that possibility. Story 27. There was a snail that lived in your nose and would bite your finger off if you put it in there. I think it was a Shel Silverstein story. Story 28. I believe there was a small society living in the bathroom fan, similar to the society in the locker in Men in Black. I also thought there were tiny societies living in chandeliers. Story 29. When there is a deceased person in a film, it is not actually the actor. It is an extremely realistic model made to resemble them. Story 30. The Muppet Babies cartoon show featured a nanny, and only her legs appeared on screen. I waited for a commercial break and ran to our living room to watch the show on the big screen. As a child, I thought she just didn't fit on my small television, and I needed a larger one to see her entire body. My older sister laughed and explained the fascinating workings of animation and television broadcasting. Story 31. When I was a child, I overheard a discussion about transgender people. The family members were upset about it, so I thought they were criminals. It seemed to me that they must have done something wrong, and being turned into the opposite gender was their punishment. Story 32. I loved animals as a child and didn't want to eat eggs. My parents told me there are two types of chickens: those that lay the eggs we eat and those that lay eggs that become chicks. I believed this to be true for a surprisingly long time. Story 33. Once a moth entered our living room while I was watching TV, and it became a belief that if I watched too much TV, insects would come to harm us. I countered that I don't watch TV. I play video games like Contra and Mario. Story 34. I could fire a bullet and make it reach the moon. Here is how it works. I would fire a bullet, then fire another right behind it and another right behind that. The bullets would keep pushing and reach the moon. Story 35. When I was 3, I thought carnival rides were operated by giants living underground who flipped a huge light switch beneath each ride to turn them on and off. Story 36. If my dog got sprayed by a skunk, it would smell like that forever. If I got hit in the head while crossing my eyes, they would be permanently stuck like that. Story 37. In Germany, we have a social system in which people who do not work receive state assistance. As a child, I believed that individuals who made special social arrangements, such as helping out at a nursery school, were the ones receiving these benefits. Story 38. The noisy toilets in elementary school did not trigger the fire alarm. I left many unflushed items that year. Story 39. I believed that animals and insects had houses, jobs, and families. A squirrel dad would come home from work gathering nuts and hang out with his family, cook dinner, and watch television in their home inside a tree. In some ways, I think I still kind of believe this. Story 40. My daughter just got the biggest laugh out of me, thinking the insemination intro to Look Who's Talking To was actual footage. To this day, I had an image in my head of a very basic sperm and egg scene with added talking, which I thought must have been filmed in vitro, only to rewatch and see how obviously animated it was. Story 41. The music in the movie theater was coming from an orchestra behind the screen. Story 42. Children are the result of marriage. My parents did not get married until I was 13. I had no sex education. Story 43. I used to think cactus was a bad word and would cry whenever I heard it. I also thought that whenever it was someone's birthday, they would grow bigger instantly. I thought Massachusetts was called mashed potatoes. Lastly, I believed clouds were solid and you could walk on them if you went high enough. Story 44. My parents emphasized that cartoons aren't real. One day, while watching the Flintstones, they played the song, "When the Saints Go Marching In." I thought it was a great song, and since cartoons aren't real, I concluded that the song wasn't real either. I believed I could tell everyone that I made the song up, sell it, and make millions of dollars. Story 45. I grew up in a diverse neighborhood in the 1970s and 1980s and thought that when you turned 10, you became a black person. I don't know what made me think this, but I spent a lot of time waiting to become 10. When I woke up on my 10th birthday and ran to the mirror, I was still white, and I cried and was heartbroken. I just wanted to be like my friend and maybe live at my friend's house because their family life wasn't as difficult as mine. Story 46. If I urinated enough, I could overflow the toilet. I would drink extra water to produce more urine and not flush, even though I knew I would get in trouble for it. I was determined to overflow that toilet. However, it was just draining out of the back, and I was too foolish to realize I wasn't even making the water rise a single millimeter. Story 47. That grandmothers are selling in the markets made me wonder why my parents bought my grandmother, who wasn't very nice. Story 48. That was when television and films featured a freeze frame. It occurred because the camera was stopped. I was very impressed that the actors could return to the exact same positions when they began filming the next episode or scene. I realized this during a freeze frame cliffhanger where two people were literally falling off a cliff into the sea, with the freeze capturing them midair. Story 49. When I heard a band or singer on the radio, I thought they called the radio station and sang into the phone. It made perfect sense to me. After all, I often heard people call in, and their voices were broadcast over my speakers. I was 4. By 5, I had figured it out. Story 50. Mine makes perfect sense. Looking back, I'm sure I must have heard my mom talking with her friends about someone having skeletons in their closet. I was terrified from a very young age and always made sure my dad closed that door tightly before I went to bed. Story 51. When I was 14, I believed the reason my labia were non-symmetrical was that I masturbated too much. Story 52. When I was young, I believed that teachers lived in schools. I remember being in kindergarten and looking around the classroom, wondering if they slept on the floor because I didn't see a bed. Story 53. The tax brackets worked in such a way that I could earn more money from overtime and actually receive less at the end of the day. I consider my 20s long enough ago that I was just a kid. Story 54. My mother sent my dog to live on a farm. They continued this for years, and I would ask where it was or if we could go visit. My mother passed away when I was 15, and I still believed it, even after knowing the cliché that parents send pets to live on a farm for their happiness. Then one day, around 22 or 23, I realized my mother had lied. Thank you, Mom. Story 55. That people who do evil eventually get there, just deserts. I still want this to be true, but the reality is that many do not, and many others get punished for things beyond their control. Story 56. Life would get better as I got older. It didn't. It just got progressively worse. Death is the only dream left. Story 57. I thought new movies took a long time to reach my small Arkansas town because they first had to go to Los Angeles, New York City, St. Louis, and Little Rock. Story 58. That consciousness is an emergent property of the universe. I now see that consciousness is fundamental. Matter emerges from it. Does it make more sense that matter organized itself into consciousness, or that consciousness organized itself into matter? Story 59. A teacher told me that every time you throw a piece of trash on the ground, it contributes to the depletion of the ozone layer. I think about it constantly, and I never throw trash on the ground because of this. Story 60. A centuries-old man lives in Spain, but for some reason insists on celebrating his birthday in our country. He has his employees climb through chimneys or enter through the back door to put candy in shoes and leave a bag full of presents. They managed to walk and ride over the rooftops and somehow hear me singing from the living room. Story 61. That all dogs were males and cats were females. The same with horses being all females and cows being males. Man, was I naive. Story 62. If we pick up our pets too much, we could give them worms. I am still hesitant to pick up any animals to this day. Story 63. I thought tapioca was the eggs of tilapia fish and that people were making pudding with them. I basically thought the little black specks were fish eggs. Story 64. In our downstairs bathroom, there lives a blue wolf who gets agitated if I fight with my brother. My mother has a unique way of raising children. Story 65. Not me, but the child thinks dinosaurs are not real regardless of the evidence we present. He is adamant that they did not exist. Story 66. For many years, I believed that serial killers came from cereal boxes. For a while, I was afraid to even touch a box of cereal, thinking a killer was inside and ready to strike. Story 67. My parents seemed to have eyes everywhere, and my dad would always be driving by. They would know if I did something wrong or skipped school. Story 68. When I found out how babies were made, I wondered why they weren't made every time a man and a woman had sex. For some reason, I figured that a baby was made only if a woman and a man had a simultaneous orgasm. This was something I believed for a very long time. Story 69. When I saw lanes on the highway marked exit only, I thought it meant that if you took that exit, you weren't allowed to get back on the highway for the rest of the day. I am not even sure how to explain my logic on that one. Story 70. My uncle told me there were alligators in the pool filter. There are no alligators in pool filters in Wisconsin. Story 71. Cars originated as small hatchbacks and have since evolved into larger vehicles such as SUVs, buses, or limousines. Story 72. If I cut myself on a piece of broken glass from a fluorescent light bulb, that cut would never heal. I have no idea why I thought that. Story 73. My mom told me when I was 3 that grease spots in parking lots were stains from little kids who didn't hold their parents' hands in parking lots and got hurt. I believed that for too long. Story 74. If I stay in the bath after the plug is pulled out, I would be sucked down the drain. I am 40 years old, and I still cannot remain in the bath while the water drains out. Story 75. That deity would take care of me and answer all my prayers if I just remembered to give my church 10% of everything I earn. Story 76. My cousin told me I was adopted and that Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were my real parents. I was skeptical but genuinely wanted to believe it. Story 77. The Easter bells. When I think about it, I find it even stranger than Santa and the little mouse for the teeth. I picture literal flying bells dropping chocolate on Easter. It makes no sense at all. Story 78. I never believed anyone's face would remain fixed in an expression adults disliked if people continued to make it, but adults often insisted with an angry intensity, as if they were ready to be upset if I expressed my disbelief. Story 79. I didn't grow up on a street with sidewalks, so I thought quicksand appeared randomly on sidewalks and that it was an obstacle everyone had to navigate. Story 80. When people died in a television program, they really died. They went ahead of time to whoever ran the show and said, I am fine being killed. I'm bored or upset. Story 81. I thought the tan patches on someone's skin were just dirt and that they could scrub it off. To be honest, I was around 6 or 8 years old and had never seen a naturally dark-skinned person in real life. I didn't know tanning was a thing. I tried to help scrub my cousin's tan feet from wearing sandals and was very confused about why the dirt wouldn't come out. Story 82. Santa Claus flying around the world in one night. We didn't have a fireplace, so I thought he came in through the heater vent. Story 83. When I was very young, I remember having serious concerns about the possibility of being sucked down the drain if I got too close while the bathwater was being emptied. For a while, my mom would get me out of the tub and into my room before opening the drain. In my defense, that particular drain made especially loud and unsettling noises. Story 84. That it was human being instead of human being. And haughty was a misspelling of haughty that somehow didn't get caught in the editing process of a published children's storybook. I thought social justice warrior was a terrible insult even though I had no clue what it meant. Just that the context I encountered it in was always pejorative without understanding what they meant by it, and that the people ranting about social justice warriors were, you guessed it, bad people. Also, that my sister and her partner at the time were married because they lived together and had a child together, and I picked up the idea that you weren't allowed to do that unless you were married. I still remember my dad turning to me and saying, "No, your sister isn't married. Do you remember them having a wedding?" And then it clicked, and I was like, huh, I guess not. And that strobe lighting and smoke effects in plays were extremely dangerous, toxic, and harmful. My brain didn't connect the obvious dots that the theater was not going to poison everyone. I just saw there was a warning for it in the booklet we were given. So I curled up in my chair, incredibly terrified, and tried to cover my skin with my coat like a blanket and breathe shallowly, because I thought if the strobe or smoke touched me, I'd die. I saw the word warning and didn't know what epilepsy was as a kid. It didn't mention epilepsy, just said warning, and I took it to mean it was warning us all. There was probably a lot more. I was often told that I lacked common sense as a child. Story 85. I thought Madonna was the queen of music and Michael Jackson the king, officially crowned as such, married to each other with crowns and everything. Story 86. I'm showing my age, but when I was a kid, I was puzzled why adults were so obsessed with peas. The radio was always talking about peace talks. Turns out it was the closing year of the Vietnam War, and everyone wanted to give peace a chance. Story 87. When I asked my mother why we had no First Nations children at my public elementary school, she responded that they attended private schools. I was envious, thinking they must be privileged, wealthy children with parents who could afford private education. Oh, how sadly mistaken I was. Story 88. I thought automated teller machines were staffed by tiny people inside the walls who handed out cash. I also believed that turning on the car's interior light at night was illegal. My parents' fibs worked too well. Story 89. When my parents wrote checks, I thought that was the money. They simply wrote the amount they needed, and it was worth that much. I was always confused about why people needed to work for money if they could just write checks instead. Story 90. I used to think that people got married because they had a child. Now, I can't believe I believed that. Story 91. I thought rivers were gaps between tectonic plates and that bridges held those plates together. I also believed that oceans existed because no one had built a bridge to keep the plates from moving apart. Story 92. When I was coloring with my friends, the blue and red markers were often dried out, but the purple ones were always good to go. So, I thought purple was stronger. That's why my favorite Dragon Ball character is Frieza. Story 93. I just thought of another one. The television show Land of the Giants used tiny people for the space crew and regular-sized people for the giants. I wasn't naive enough to believe in actual giants. Story 94. Gold is said to be at the end of the rainbow. It is not possible for a graphical illusion created by water to contain gold. However, as a child, I was convinced I was told the truth. Story 95. There are two little men in the television who project shows on the screen inside the TV. It wasn't a fully developed theory. Story 96. The nuns told us it was actually Jesus on the other side of the panel in the confessional, and he was writing out a list of my sins before he granted forgiveness. It was a couple of years before I actually saw a priest walking into the center cabinet where Jesus was supposed to be, and thus began my disillusionment with the Roman Catholic Church. Story 97. When looking at old family photos, I used to think the world was literally black, white, and gray. I often wondered how wonderful it must have been when color was invented for the first time. Story 98. The toilet flushed water that fed into the sink. I never turned on the sink until I flushed the toilet twice, and then there was clean water to wash my hands. Story 99. Whenever I saw a fashion runway show, I thought it resembled a slave auction, where people were buying the models instead of appreciating the clothes or designs. I don't know why I ever thought that. Nothing really indicates that being the case, but that was my perception. Story 100. I prayed every night that my grandparents wouldn't die, and it seems to have worked since they are still alive. Story 101. The world used to be in black and white, which is why old photos are black and white. However, wealthy individuals could afford colors, which is why there are many colorful paintings of them from before the advent of color photography. Story 102. I thought Sailor Moons were a ripoff of science books because I was obsessed with astronomy as a child. Story 103. Santa Claus makes no sense to me now, but when I was 6 or 7, I absolutely believed in him. I know the saint and the whole story have some truth to them, but I am referring to the man in the red suit and the reindeer, which is absolutely insane. Story 104. That people lived where they worked. I have no idea why I thought this, because I knew my dad came home from work and lived in the same house with us. Story 105. Teachers really do have eyes in the back of their heads, and having this ability hidden by your hair is a job requirement to become a teacher. Story 106. Before I knew what friction was, I thought I could create a perpetual motion machine using a combination of a water wheel and a small waterfall. It was going to be a model, and I believed we could generate infinite electricity from it. I thought that apparently no one before me had ever considered this idea. I was around 8 or 9 years old and really into science. I never actually attempted to build the model. I don't remember why now. I probably got distracted. I do remember explaining my idea to my grandfather in detail when we went to watch fireworks. He had a look that I realized much later was pride. He was a smart man but had dropped out of school after 8th grade due to extreme poverty and earned his general educational development certificate in the Army. He was incredibly proud of my sister and me for being interested in science, math, and reading. He once gave me a book about the history of the Panama Canal because he thought I would enjoy it. I wish he had been around to see my sister earn her Doctor of Philosophy degree. He would have told everyone he talked to, whether or not he knew them. Story 107. I killed my friend's dad. Every time we had a sleepover at her house, her dad had so many rules I didn't like that I wished he would go away. When he died, I felt really guilty, as if my wish had caused his death. Story 108. I believed that girls and women could always tell when someone was lying. Then I saw other kids lying to the teacher about something, and she believed them. I told the truth, and she didn't believe me. Story 109. I thought actors who died in movies actually died and gave their lives for the performance. That is why film awards like the Oscars were so prestigious. Story 110. I had to wake up and say to myself that the world is going to end today because I remembered learning at church that no one would know when the end times would occur. My reasoning was that if I said it was going to happen, then it wouldn't happen. I stressed and had anxiety over whether I needed to say it again and if it would count. I'm an atheist now. Story 111. When I was a child, diaper commercials often showed a hand pouring blue liquid into the diaper. Later, I saw a pad advertisement that did the same thing. For years, I believed that women lost their bladder control once a month and had to wear mini diapers. I also thought that women and babies urinated blue liquid. Story 112. Before I knew how to spell any words, I thought that curse words had to have many letters. I imagined that shit was probably spelled something like splick sustimbitpuv, or something slightly more sensible, but definitely with X's and Z's included. I thought all letters were used fairly equally, and even once I started learning spelling, I noticed that X and Z were used so rarely because they must appear more often in adult words that I was too young to be allowed to say or spell yet. Story 113. When there was black and white television, the world was also black and white. People lived to 100 and grew as tall as the sky. We were being watched like a television show by beings outside of Earth. I miss my imagination. Story 114. When I was very young, I thought that people were filled with blood. I had no concept of veins or arteries. I simply believed we were full of blood. Story 115. I'm sure my mom told me that the song "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree" was actually an Easter song, and I believed her for years. She denies it, and despite the content of the song and the usual time of year it is played, I still can't shake the feeling that it's an Easter song. Story 116. I thought that at some point, children would outgrow their parents. I used to believe that the younger you were, the faster you aged. Story 117. My mother had a phobia of anything getting close to her eyes, including doctors looking into them. She often told us that when she was a child, she was cross-eyed and had very poor vision. It was so bad that they performed surgery on her eyes. I believed all of that. However, I later realized that a couple of things didn't add up. For example, why would she be sitting up during surgery? Why would her mother be present for that surgery? And why would she traumatize her child by sharing something so graphic? Story 118. I believe that all movies, or at least musicals, were shot in real time like a play. I remember a conversation with my mom as a kid where she tried to explain to me for about an hour that the kids weren't actually controlling the puppets and that the professional puppeteers weren't jumping in and out throughout the song, because I couldn't comprehend the concept of video editing. Story 119. Baby germs. I don't know where I got this, but I had a strange obsession with baby germs. I believed that babies would leave their germs on anything they touched, and I refused to touch anything they did. If pressed for details about how old a baby had to be, I would just make up new rules about how baby germs worked. I have no idea why this concept was so prominent in my mind. Story 120. I thought the actors in movies had to perform the scenes as I watched them, and when we paused the movie, they needed to remain completely still. Story 121. The fish tank filters produced water. It was as if you plugged them in and they magically made fresh water flow into the tank without any plumbing connections, and somehow they did not cause it to overflow. Story 122. I felt sorry for inanimate objects. For example, when someone kicks a can, I feel sad for the can. I have always been a little unusual. Story 123. Flushing a toilet created such a strong vortex that it would pull all the ghosts in the house straight to the bathroom. I would wash my hands first, flush the toilet with a tissue to keep my hands clean, and walk away as quickly and calmly as I could so nobody would notice I was freaked out. Story 124. When I was little, I thought that when filming a child version of a character, they did it when the actor was young and had to wait years for that actor to grow up to play the adult character to continue the movie or show. Story 125. The Santa Claus thing. On our local television station, as in many others, the meteorologist talked about the weather for Santa's journey on Christmas Eve. Other kids laughed at me and told me it was all a lie, yet my mom insisted they were wrong. My mom's motives still don't make sense to me decades later. Story 126. Religion. I don't think I would say I believe in it, but I doubt it. As an adult, I am certain I do not. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.